Hello, all the nerds out there. I hope you are busy with your nerdy stuff and what? Guess today. Leave everything behind and come join this session where we are going to discuss about English Renaissance theater. And write hi in the comment right now so I'll know how many of you are here. So, anyway, so let's begin. As I promised that from today, and we are going to discuss English in the Renaissance theater. And well, I'm pretty excited, and I hope you all are too. So let's jump into the topic. And here is English Renaissance Theater in front of your screen, right? So let's move to the introduction. And whatever you know about English Renaissance Theater or Elizabethan Theater, Caroline Theater or Jacobean Theater, just write anything in the chat box right now. So shall we move? And here I'm getting comments, chat here. Okay, so everyone is ready. Fine. So let's start, and we are moving to the introduction, right? And so it's, if you would ask me when it began, this English Renaissance, it is like kind of big timeline. So let's dive into this world of English Renaissance theater. So picture this: it's the year between 1558 and 1642. Of course, in England, and everyone is like, going crazy for plays. We're talking about the time of awesome playwrights like Shakespeare, Marlowe, Johnson, and many more, right? So now, when we say English Renaissance theater, we are talking about a specific period from 1562 to 1642. But hold on, Elizabethan is kind different. Elizabethan actually falls under this. So Elizabethans refers only to the year when Queen Elizabeth ruled the kingdom, right? So from the date is, you have to remember, 1558 to 1603. So that is when Elizabethan theater started. And again, now if we move, like, it covers like a bit more ground. So we have got like Elizabethan theater from 1562 to 1603. Then we have Jacobean theater, and here you can see the date, which starts from 1603 to 1625. Right, and then we have that Charles, like Caroline theater, from 1625 to 1642. Got it? Great, cool. So during Queen Elizabeth reign, the theater scene was kind of blast because it brought people from all all walks of life together. So imagine this: the fancy royals and the regular folk both enjoyed watching the same plays in public playhouse. So it was like one big happy theater family. So but as time went on, things changed. And how it changed? Private theaters started popping up, and they catered more to the upper class crowd. So by the time Charles first took the throne, not many new plays were being written for the public theater. They were all, like they were all just riding, on a back of classics, whatever it was written previously, for the previous decade. So that's what happened there. And now let's talk about the education in the Renaissance theater. And back then, grammar school were all the rage, and they focused on teaching kids grammar, logic, and all that smart stuff, right? And the students would dive into Latin, Greek texts, write their own stuff, memorize it, and then perform it in the front of the teachers and their friends. And they even put on Latin and English plays during special occasion and holidays. And it was like their own little Shakespeare festival. So then you had the choir school, and that was connected to Queen Elizabeth's court. And these schools were all about putting on plays and other fun stuff to Her Majesty. But guess what? They started performing for the regular folks too. So it all started in the 1560s to 1570s. So out of these choir school to the came to know as Boy Actors Company. So playwrights like John Lilly and Ben Jonson were hired to write plays specifically for these young actors. So if you talk about an early career break, so that's where it is. So the university, then again, it came to university. So these universities were, also had their say in theater scene. They loved their academic drama, influenced by old school stuff like miracles and morality plays that we have already discussed in our previous class. So the university, especially Oxford and Cambridge, were the places to be if you wanted to get a degree, right? So they rediscovered and performed Latin and Greek plays during the English Renaissance. Even Queen Elizabeth herself enjoyed watching these plays when she visited. So, if you're thinking the party has stopped, the party didn't stop there. There was a famous play cycle called the Parnassus, and these plays that was written and performed at the university. So remember that name. So now that's some kind of highbrow entertainment. And after graduating, many students headed to the inns of court. And if they were like studying law, so these inns of court were communities of lawyers and like smart university alumni and some big literary figures like John Donne, Francis Beaumont, and these were all out there. And the inns of court had their own lord of miserable and all kinds of, you know, plays like we have Garboturk and the Misfortunes of Arthur, even Shakespeare's play like the Comedy of Errors and Twelfth Night were performed there. And even though they were originally written for the big commercial theater. So as we know, Shakespeare always a crowd pleaser, right? So now let's talk about the grandest party of them all, and that was the mask. And these were like super fancy, and that were all the rage in the 16th and early 17th century. So they started in Italy and spread like wildfire in other countries. So these parties had it all: their music, dancing, singing, and acting. And we are not talking about some simple stage setup here. It was actually, they were designed by famous architect and looked seriously impressive. And they even hired professional actors and musicians to perform. And get this, sometime the non-speaking or non-singing roles were filled by fancy courtiers like the cool kids from the royal court. Queen Anne of Denmark once also performed there and loved to get her dance on and mask with her ladies. And even kings like Henry VIII, Charles the First of England joining in and having all the fun. So if you talk about some royal dance move, you might see there. So in France, so they had their own version called ballet, and even King Louis the 14th himself was a dance machine as versatile. And the music for these ballads was done by a guy named called Jean Baptiste Lully actually. Fancy, huh? So all in all, masks were all about showing off and making the guests feel like they were the bees, And it was a way for the rich and powerful. And these guys had to really blast and enjoy some kind of, top-notch entertainment. Sounds like, quite the party, right? So this is all about introduction, and immediately we'll move to the playhouses, and that is quite important also for the exam point of view. So here you have it. You can see one side a little bit description about it, and the other is the list of the area, right? And this is all in chronologically order, so you have to just remember that also. So let's start with the playhouse. So back then, back in the day, they tried opening this English theater called the Red Lion in 1567, but it was kind of total flop. It didn't last long at all. But then came along the real game changers like the theater in 1576, which was a kind of huge success. And you see, these big theaters were kind of game changer for English Renaissance drama. And they made it possible for plays to be a permanent thing, not just some temporary show, but they created a kind of trend there. And the idea for these theater came from when the mayor and Corporation of London decided to ban plays in 1572 because of the plague. Then in 1575 they kicked all the actors out of the city altogether. So to get around that, they built permanent theatre outside London's jurisdiction, and they set them up in places like Holywell, in Shoreditch, and later the Cling, as well as the Nevington Bath. So near this entertainment hotspot called St George Fields in rural Surrey. So the theater was kind of the one of the first thing. Theater, the name is the theater actually. So this was actually the first one to pop up in Shoreditch in 1576. Remember the date, and all thanks to James Burbage and his brother-in-law John Burbage, Brian. And they were the same folks who owned that failed Red Lion. Remember in the beginning of this session we talked. And this Red Lion Playhouse, which was actually published in built in 1567, right? And after this failure, they decided to again open another, which was the theater, right? 1576. And then came the Curtain Theatre, which was 1577. Then the Rose in 1587. Then the Swan in 1595. And here comes the well popular one, the Globe in 1599. So these days you have to remember, and also remember the chronologically order of these plays. And then on the 1600 we got Fortune, and at the end we had the Red Bull in 1604. So these theatre were a pretty big deal, and they paved the way for English drama to thrive and gave it a kind of permanent home. So back in the late 20th century, they dug up the foundation of the Rose and the Globe Theatre and found out that all the theatres in London were a bit different, but had some kind of similar layout. So these public theatres were kind of 3 stories tall and had a big open space in the middle. They were usually like roundish, but a couple of them were square. And inside there were 3 levels of galleries facing the center, where the stage was. And the back of the stage was used for actors to enter and exit, and also for the musician to sit and play. And the upper level behind the stage could be used as a balcony or for an actor to talk to the crowd. And the cheapest seats were in the pit, where the poorest folk could watch the show. Later on, they added a new part of the theater called gullet, and which was like a hidden corridor, and that actors used to quickly change their clothes and also whatever the costume they had on the stage. So these theaters were mostly made of wood and plaster, and they were built to hold a lot of people. Now, there was a different kind of theatre also called the Blackfriar. And why it was so different? Because this theatre, the Blackfriar Theatre, started being used regularly in 1599. It was smaller than the older theatres and had a roof instead of being open to the sky. So it was more like the theatres we have today. So after that, they built more small enclosed theatres like the Whitefriars, and also there was the Cockpit. So by the early 1600s, the London audience had total six theatres to choose from. And 3 big open airs, as we know, has the Globe, the Fortune, and the Red Bull. And these other 3 smaller indoor ones, the Blackfriar, the Cockpit, and the Salisbury Court. Right. So people in the 1630s had lots of plays to enjoy. Both the classics by Marlowe and Shakespeare and new works by upcoming playwrights, which were performed at both the big public theatres and the smaller private ones. And around 1580s, when both the theatre and the curtain were like packed during the summer, the total capacity of London theatres were around 5,000 spectators. But things changed after 1610 when new theatres were built and new theatre groups formed. So by then, London's total theatre capacity has gone over to 10,000 people. And also, one more thing was there, like people, the ticket prices back then weren't fixed actually. and they varied depending on where you wanted to sit and how much you could afford. So if you wanted a better view of the stage or preferred some distance from the rowdy crowd, you had to shell out more money. And hey, within, and at that time there was, I'm just adding this, so because everything was getting expensive, right? Inflation is there, and with inflation kicking in, tickets prices in some theater went up from a penny to sixpence or even higher. So here you can see the list of the theater. The Red Lion, the Theater, Curtain Theater, the Rose, the Swan, the Globe, the Fortune, Red Bull, Black Friar, White Friar, the Cockpit. So all this you have to remember in order anyway. So this was all about Playhouse. Now we'll move to the costume, and that costume actually make me laugh a couple of times because I've seen the description and all this stuff. But anyway, this costume, so as we know, back in Elizabethan era, costume was kind of, they played a big role in theater because they made up for the lack of fancy sets and props, and they were like eye candy for the audience and a crucial part of the whole performance. The costumes were really colorful and captivating to look at. Different colors represented social status. So if a character was a king or queen, they would wear purple to show off their royalness, and the costume helped the audience to understand who was who when the character first showed up on the stage. So instead of making costumes specifically for each actor, theater companies had like collection of costumes that they would pick from. So they would reuse costume whenever possible and rarely had new ones made. So costumes were pretty expensive. So often the actors would just wear their own everyday clothes regardless of the time period of the play. So the fanciest costumes were reserved for like high class characters because clothing was a way to show off their social status, right? So the fabrics used in the theater would also indicate how well off the theater company was. So they used fabrics like velvet was there, satin, silk, gold, and embroidered cloth, lace, and of course fur. So what happened? Actors would, sometimes leave their costume to other actors in their wills, and theater master would do the same for their servants. However, the servants weren't allowed to wear fancy clothes themselves. Instead, they would sell them back to the theater company. So in those times, there were rules about what kind of clothes people from different social classes could wear. There was a clear distinction between the classes, and the wealthy people liked to show off their status through their clothing. But actors and the others were exception to this kind of rule because their clothes represented their livelihood, and they were allowed to dress above their social standing if they belonged to the licensed acting company, and they were playing specific roles in the production. So that was in the costume. Now we'll just quickly move to the acting and performance. So here you will know what kind of thing were happening in this on the stage. So the performance. So like back in the old days, acting company had a really interesting way of doing things. Unlike today, where you could just watch the same show for months or even year, these guys hardly ever perform the same play like 2 days in a row. It's like they had a serious case of commitment issue with their plays, right? You know what happened? What I'm going to tell you here about that, you have seen so many plays, right? You have read so many, and you're thinking like there was so much success there at that time, but actually the writer who wrote all these plays, right, they also struggled, also actors struggled. So not only success was there, but also behind that there were a lot of failure. And how, I'll just show you, I'll just try to explain this in this lecture, sorry, the session anyway. Back in the old days, as we know, these companies had like interesting ways to do things. So at that time it had like they have very little time to prepare and then immediately do it, and again in 2 days there will be different play, then they have to revise all this. So all these troubles were there for the actors. So let me tell you about this crazy incident. There was this play called A Game at Chess by Thomas Middleton, right? And that actually ran for 9 shows in a row. in August 1624, and that was kind of pretty impressive at that time if it goes over a week. And the authorities, uh, shut it down because they didn't like the political stuff in it. So it would have gone, more. So it was kind of very famous play that came at chess. It was quite funny, hilarious, and all these things. And we'll also talk about in our next session. So now let's talk about Lord Strangeman. You must have heard about this group, and during their 1592 season at the Rose Theatre, these guys were quite the workaholic, and they performed like 6 days a week, taking only Good Friday and a couple of other days off. And get this, they played a whopping 23 different plays, especially at that time, and some of them were only performed once, and which is like one hit wonder in the theater world. But the real crowd pleaser was the first part of Hieronymo, based on Kids the Spanish Tragedy. They rocked that play like 15 times, and if you can just say, they were like, hey, why play the same thing again and again when there are so many plays to choose? Because of that, they have to move to different play. Otherwise, that was big hit back then. And I can't even imagine the workload of those actors had, especially the big shots like Richard Burbage, right, and Edward Allen, these two greatest actor at that time. And they must have been like juggling more roles than a circus performer. And I mean, memorizing these lines here and rehearsing and putting on a show every day sounds exhausting, right? But these guys were kind of the original multitasker, if you say. And let's not forget about the lighting situation. And during daylight shows, they had no fancy light. So when it got dark, imagine what they had to do. They had to light up some candles. And can you imagine the chaos if someone accidentally knocked over a candle? What could happen? A fire hazard, right? So, and don't expect any fancy backdrop of any elaborate sets. They relied on the actors' descriptions and especially the costume to paint the scene. And talk about using your imagination. I bet there were like moments when the audience had no clue what was going on. Can you imagine that? And maybe they were like too busy trying to figure out who was who in those confusing roles. So it also happened there. But they also had like clever trick of their sleeps. And what was like, it was like when there weren't enough actors to cover all the characters, guess what, they just had like double role, and one actor playing multiple roles at the same time. And now that's some another kind of multitasking that the actors have to do. So it's like having a one-man show with a cast of thousands. Impressive, right? But anyway, now let's talk about the acting style. What was there? And they had the formal and natural. So formal acting was all proper and traditional, while natural acting aimed to like make the audience believe in the fictional world by staying in the character. So it's like the difference between someone just playing a role and someone totally becoming the character. And this is all about the performance and acting there. And now let's move to the another section, which is about playwrights. And here you will I will have one picture also to explain their career, all the playwrights, major playwrights in fact, and what the age they have. I'll just show it, zoom it later, but first we'll just discuss about uh, and then at the end I'll show you the picture. So back in the day, London was booming with people and money. They were all about the spectacle and loved their drama. And get this, out of all these plays written for the Elizabethan stage, we have managed to get only like 600 of them. And now, like the folk who wrote these plays were mostly self made men, nothing fancy. Some went to like fancy schools like Oxford and Cambridge, but many didn't. And one of them was our William Shakespeare. And uh, so these most of these playwrights weren't big on performing themselves, and none of the big short authors who came around after 1600 had to resort to like uh, make a living by acting. So they had some other, tricks. And how they survived, because at that time there were like, overpopulated plays, so many plays, so many writers, playwriters. And also the problem was their living, and they were just getting, paid few pound for it, or even sometime penny. So these were the life out there for playwriters. So if you're thinking like, life as a playwright was like big thing at that time, but it wasn't, a walk in the park. And they were paid in little bits and pieces while writing the play. And if their work got accepted, they'd get some money from one day's performance. But once a play was sold to a company, the company owned it. It's similar like it happened when you're publishing a book, you're giving everything to a publisher, right? All the copyrights and other thing. So it was happening back then for the drama as well. And the playwright had like zero say in casting, performance, changes, whatever he wanted, he could not do. Exactly like the writer when you give your book to the publishing company, right? So it was like, losing all his creative sense. So being a dramatist at that time was tough and definitely not a money making machine. Records show that a guy named Philip Hanslow paid as little as £6 or £7 for a play in the 1600, and that was probably, on the low end. But even the best writer couldn't demand much more. Working alone, a playwright could only manage like 2 plays a year at most. Imagine that, like having, you know less than 10-20 pounds, and for each play, working for a year must have been a hard work for them, right? And because of that, we have now collaboration and stuff. We can just see there. Anyway, we'll move to this part soon. So imagine that in the 1630s, there was this guy named Richard Brome. He was also, signed a contract to write at least 3 plays a year. But this guy couldn't keep up. And on the other hand, Shakespeare, the legendary wordsmith, produced fewer than 40 solo plays over his long career. And you must be wondering, why he made good money. Because he was an actor also, and also he was quite smart that he was also a shareholder in the company he worked for. Plus, he had a stake in the theater they used. So, what you can say about Willie? He was quite smart guy, right? So now, there was some other playwright who also found like different paths to success. Like Ben Jonson, for example, made it big by putting on fancy shows like Mask, remember, to the court. And he knew how to play the game and get the support of the important folk. But those poor souls who were just playwrights, imagine their life, imagine their struggle, So there was this guy, biographer of George Peele and Robert Greene and Richard Brome and Phillipson. They were all, according to him, was broke, pretty much broke, and had a kind of, rough time at that time. And to deal with their slow writing pace, these playwrights did what? They teamed up. So isn't it 2 heads are better than the one, right? Or in this case, not 2 but 3 or 4 or even 5 heads sometime. So most of these plays were written back then were in collaboration, only because they wanted to write more, they wanted to earn more. So that's why they collaborated. So the ones who preferred to fly solo, like Johnson and Shakespeare, were the kind of odd ones out. And sharing the work meant sharing the money, right? But it seemed to work out fine for them. Take an example of Thomas Dekker. This guy is just collaborated with everyone there. And out of his 70 plays, about 50 were collaboration. So in 1 year, he worked on like 16 collaboration and made some decent cash. So it was said he earned about twice as much as the average working playwright at that time. So it is not too shabby, right? So now, again, I just want to mention a couple of things more. So as a writing a play, on your own, it took months. But when you're making, if you're a team of 4 or 5 writers, they could whip up a play in just 2 weeks. Crazy, right? But here's the thing. Even with all the planning and promising, Some of Henslow's hired playwrights couldn't deliver the play, and they take advances and all but fail to produce something worth putting on the stage. So that was all happening there. So this is all you have, and now we'll just move to quickly to see this chart that I found in Wikipedia, and it's quite important, you know, very useful to figure out about all these playwrights. We'll start with George Peele. So much of his career was, he was born here, and then he had, you know, you can see the blue represent playwriting career, and that blue, this light blue is for their life, and the green that we, this is the green which shows the opening of Burbage Theatre, and this is the black is the extension of all the kings and queens, all the monarch, and this is the red is the closing theater. Here we had the theater closed, and you can see George Peele, which was born here in Elizabethan era, even before Elizabethan era, and his career was all in where, in Elizabethan theatre, and especially after opening the Burbage Theatre. So before that, there was no one that who had created a play before Burbage opened the theatre. So you don't have to worry about that. That you have to remember before Elizabethan. So everything is after Burbage, the theatre, right? His theatre, the name is the theatre. Anyway, so again, you can see here John Lilly, whose career was again in Elizabethan era, and similar is happening with Monday Thomas K. Christopher Marlowe, whose career was short but very impressive, and Robert Greene, William Shakespeare, you see, has also his career in Elizabethan theatre and also moved to James, right, Jacobean era. So he's like, you know, the bridge between two. So, and again we have the George Chapman, who was the, you know, last, you know, by the ending of Elizabethan one era, and then most of his career was in Jacobean era. And again we have Ben Jonson, and this guy had like a very long and fruitful career, right? You can see starting with Elizabethan, then Jacobean, and also moved to the Caroline era. So this is quite important, that this kind of question they ask sometime, and this is for the Ben Jonson had his playwriting career almost in all era, starting with Elizabethan and then Jacobean and Charles. So everywhere he had. So you can see this guy, you know, everywhere. And again we have Thomas Dekker, whose career started with the Elizabethan theatre and then Jacobean theatre. So he didn't move to the Caroline. So through that, you have to remember from here, Thomas Middleton, they are all Jacobean, right? Even Webster, a little bit Thomas Heywood, who wrote in Elizabethan, but majority of his plays belong to the Jacobean and Caroline. So you can see all the, and this you will get in Wikipedia also, and anyway I'll share it with you too in the Google Classroom. So this is all about the playwright, right? And now we'll just quickly move to genre and also the published text, and it's quite important to know that too, what kind of genre was there. So back in the day there were like different types of play. People who enjoyed these plays were like, you know, one popular genre was the history play, and why we know about it, because of us Shakespeare, right? Which actually this history play showed English and European history, and Shakespeare had plays like Richard III, Henry V, where he talked about kings and their lives. Other playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and George Peele also dabbed the, you know, like these history plays with their play like King Edward II and King Edward I. And the second was the tragedy were a kind of big hit too. Marlowe's plays like Dr. Faustus and the Jew of Malta were like super successful at that time. People really got into like revenge dramas like Thomas Kidd's The Spanish Tragedy, and of course we can't forget Shakespeare's greatest tragedies, you know, like Hamlet, Othello, King Lear and Macbeth. They were all kind of great hit. hits. And comedies were all the rage as well. There was this cool subgenre also called city comedy, which hilariously poked fun at life in London. And it was like a Roman comedy, right? We already talked about Roman comedy. Menander was there, the new comedy that he employed, where he discussed about the ordinary people or daily life there. It is exactly happening here as well. So it was completely like Roman comedy, but set in modern time. Imagine Thomas Decker's the Shoemaker's Holiday, or Thomas Middleton's A Chaste Maid in Cheapside. So it is all about cracking jokes about city life. But even the old fashioned genre had their influence too. You had pastorals like plays like The Faithful Shepherdess, which had shepherds and all the romantic stuff you can imagine. And believe it or not, even morality plays like made a comeback with plays like Four Plays in One. That is actually name of the play, and it was like old meets new. And after 1610, there was this funky new genre called tragicomedy. And what happened there? It was actually it mixed tragedy and comedy together, and people loved it. And during the reign of the first two Stuart kings, James First and Charles the First, masks were also kind of trending there, and it was like a fancy party with costume and performance, right? And they even had plays based on biblical story, like like Peele's David and Bathsheba as one of the few examples. So this is all about genre there. Let's a little bit talk about the printing thing. So back in the day, not many of those fancy English Renaissance plays actually made it into print. Can you believe it? How many plays you would have had if they were all printed? So out of Haywood's whopping 222 plays, only around 20 of them were lucky enough to publish in a book. And in the whole era, they only managed to publish a single over like 600 plays in total. And get this, most of them came out as individual quarto edition. So those big collected edition like the one we have of Shakespeare, Ben Jonson and Beaumont and Fletcher's play, which are all bundled together. And now back you can, so this is all about the publishing and what kind of plays were printed. And now we are at the end of the lecture, which is the closure of theatre in London, and which was in 1642. And that's quite important, and also that is our closure of this session, right? So anyway, if you haven't subscribed the channel, you do it now before you just skip. Okay. And London theatre, which was closed in 1642. And did you know that back in the day, those Puritans, so because of the Puritans that we don't have more plays, if you can say, because imagine if the theater was not banned, how it would have been the growth of theater. There would have been so much creativity, so many things. But again, politics always in some way they put their what can I say, so these politics always like a big hinder in the creativity. But anyway, I'm not just particular saying about anything. So let's jump back to what we are here for. So those Puritans were not big fans of theater, and they thought it was like a sinful form of entertainment. They were or like, if you say in what they were like, if they have some leader, they would say like, no way, we don't want any of that mirth and levity. So they didn't want it. So when the first English war started in 1642, the Long Parliament, which was under the influence of Puritans, and what they did, they decided to close down all the theatres in London. And they were like, sorry folk, no more stage plays during these times of humiliation. And here's a funny part. Despite the ban, some theatre were like, they didn't completely shut down. Some sneaky actors still found a ways to perform, even though they were, treated like a rogue. They even tried to convince Parliament to reopen the theatre by writing a pamphlet called the Actors' Remonstrance or Complaint. So they were like, come on, we have cleaned up all the shit that we were talking about. Now everything is clean, no more obscene, no more, hilarious jokes or dirty jokes. We promise, let it open. I'm just, putting it in my words. So, well, the ban lasted for a long time, guys. You won't believe it how long. It was like 18 years of no theater. Imagine right now if, somehow your government banned Netflix at all the theaters right now. What will you do? For 18 years, man. You'll almost forget everything, right? So, let's move back to Renaissance theater. So, back then in 1660, when King Charles II came to power after the English Restoration, he was like, all right, let's bring back the theaters, guys. Now the Netflix is here for you. And under a new licensing system, they opened two theaters, the King's Company and the Duke's Company. So it was kind of, fresh start for English theater. And they even started performing some of the older plays. And so during the ban, they had also these funny little plays called draws, and that were also allowed at that time. But the full length plays were like, no, you cannot perform. So the theaters themselves weren't closed, but they were like used for other stuff instead of a staging play. So can you imagine going to the theater expecting a play and ending up, watching something completely different? So what happened there? They started like poetry and other stuff, sonnets, then we have. So it all happened there. Anyway, after the ban was lifted, the English theater, scene went through some changes. They came up with new genre like restoration comedy, spectacle, which gave the theater a whole new vibe in the later 17th century. So it was like a theatrical rebirth, and everyone was excited to see what would happen on the next date. And I hope you're also excited what's going to happen in our next session. And there we'll talk about tragedy. Gorboduc will talk about a Spanish tragedy, and then we'll talk about Shakespeare. Well, man, there are so many things that we can talk about. And that was just an introduction. And from tomorrow, we'll just move to plays. And I know that's what you're waiting for. But before that, we needed all these to be clear. Like we have cleared our Greek tragedy, Greek comedy, then we had Roman plays, so many things we talked about, right? And we are going to continue this trend. We are going to talk about everything. And maybe from tomorrow, the session will be a little bit smaller, so you can watch quickly, right? And remember that if you want, to complete the video quickly, you can do, there is setting in YouTube that you can set up your playback speed and make it to 1.5 or 1.25. It'll also save you a couple of more minutes, right? But anyway, that's all for today, all my nerds there. And don't forget to subscribe, and also try to like the video. And that's what I want from you all. So bye bye, and here I'm going to wrap up this session, and I'll see you in our next session. Thank you so much. Bye bye, and have a good day.